Most of us walk past creeks without ever thinking about what holds them together. But in this episode, biologist Zack Graham explains why crayfish, crawfish, crawdads are one of the most important and endangered animals in North America, and what their disappearance says about the health of our waters. This is a conversation about attention, place, and the quiet collapse happening beneath the surface. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. So I was just telling you, like, before we hopped on here, like, how geeked I am. This book showed up unexpectedly on my desk one day. Yeah, UNC Press sends me a bunch of stuff, right? I do a lot of their stuff, and I'm friends with folks over there. And then this beautiful thing shows up. I open up. I'm like, what's this, right?
Mine too.
Yeah, there you go, right? I mean, congratulations. You the book released this week, right?
Yeah, it was Tuesday.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's awesome. For people who are listening in right now, I've read the book. Now it's an incredibly fun read. It's so unlikely. Like, this thing does not read like a science book like I was expecting. And I'm an environmental historian. I like to read science. This feels different somehow, and I'm so excited to talk to you about it. All right, but before we start jumping into all things crawfish, crayfish, crawdad, whatever, let's talk a little bit about you. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you're doing here?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Zack Graham. Currently, I'm an assistant professor of biology at West Liberty University, and that's in the northern panhandle of West Virginia. So, like, the northern part smudged in between Ohio and Pennsylvania. I'm a biology professor there. I teach a lot. I do a lot of research. Spend most of my free time thinking about crawdads, researching them, studying them, learning everything I can. And this is something I haven't done professionally my entire life. But pretty much once I found out I could be a biologist, that's all I've ever wanted to do. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, about an hour or so from where I live now, catching these animals, not studying them or anything, but just having fun outside, and kind of ended up in a biology career and wanted to teach some people. So so that's kind of a little bit about me.
I guess you have to forgive the pun, but it feels like a rather organic origin story for you.
Yeah.
And I felt a lot of this as I was reading your book. We'll talk a little bit about Brobridge here in a bit, but like, I felt definitely a similarity here between your story and mine as far as just the love of the animal. And it's fascinating to me, man. This book comes across, we think about a lot about, like, charismatic megafauna and these indicators of ecosystems and stuff like that. And as much as dealing as I've had with crawfish my entire life, I never really thought about this animal like this. And I felt a bit ashamed, Zach. I was like, maybe I've just been taking this thing for granted this whole time. Because there's a really, really cool story here. You want to talk a little bit about, like, okay, you're what, digging around the woods in Pennsylvania, like in Pittsburgh? I thought people watched football. Like, what? How did you come across crawfish? Like, I grew up in the South thinking crawfish were a Southern thing, and that's just not true at all. We'll talk about that today too. But, like, how did you come to crawfish as a profession?
Yeah, I think really when I was a kid, a lot of it I think actually started with, like, Pokemon. Catching Pokemon in the video games, collecting the cards, and, like, Pokemon, most of them are based off of animals. And so I eventually just realized, like, there were Pokemon outside. There were animals, So I started learning about animals, reading about animals. I had all those, like, little guidebooks where you flip through the pages and, like, these animals you're never going to see because you're just seeing, like, a robin over and over again. But I eventually, like, just ended up, when my family went camping, there was a stream near there. We'd camp either in a cabin or, like, traditional camping, and there was always a stream nearby. So I was always out in the stream catching frogs and fish and little salamanders, and one of my favorite things was crayfish. So Like there's literally photos of me when I'm, I think, 6 years old holding up a little crayfish. And then later, like 30 years later, I went to that stream and collected crayfish for my PhD, or 20 years later or something like that.
That is awesome.
So yeah, eventually never really thought it was going to be my career. I never met a biologist until I was like a junior in college when I took a biology non-majors class. I don't have a biology undergraduate degree. I have a psychology undergraduate degree. But once I met a biologist, I was like, that's what I want to do. Like I thought psychology was cool, which is just like human biology essentially. But once I learned that there were people getting paid to study animals and teach people about animals, it was kind of off to the races. And it wasn't a direct path straight to crayfish, but eventually I kind of had a little bit of say in what I could do for my research, and I chose these animals for many reasons.
Well, dude, I am so glad that you did, because this is such a real, I mean, as people will read this book, it's such a really cool story about like this animal. I think a lot of us maybe take for granted. I think most people are probably familiar with this animal. You see them or whatever, these little things, they look like little freshwater lobsters. And you don't think a lot of them unless you eat them or something like that. You know, they belong in the stream, but you don't spend a lot of time talking about crayfish, but maybe we should. And I'm kind of wondering, when you start talking about what it is that you do, you go to wherever you're at dinner or whatever, people you start like, I do crawfish, right? Are there misconceptions about this animal that you come across? Do people have these wild misunderstandings? It's like, what do you hear when you talk about this animal?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing and same experiences that you're sharing, where you didn't know about them. Like you know of them. Like you've caught them as a kid, you've eaten them, you've seen them being eaten, you've used them as fishing bait, but that's about all that you know. And that's all I knew until I was like 21 years old, 22 years old in my PhD. It's not like I was very well versed in their diversity and behavior. So I was just like you, where I thought they were just, one or two different species, and they were all brown and they all kind of lived in the creek, and that's about all. But then really, like, one of my main goals of research with this book is to study their diversity, study all the different types that there are, study all the different shapes and sizes and colors that they come in. And so I think that's the biggest misconception, is that they're kind of like this boring brown bug that lives in the mud. And some of them are, even though they're still really interesting. But for the most part, there's a ton of diversity here. There's so many different types. They're so impactful and so important to the ecosystems that I live in, you live in, really everyone is impacted by them in some way.
Yeah, there are just so many different things. I guess let's lay this out here, because I came into this thing, I grew up in Louisiana, used to the red mud bug, right, that we would boil up.
Yeah.
My last name, we moved to Louisiana when I was 3. So Jason Herbert very quickly became Jason Abear down in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, right? So I grew up Cajun as anybody else. And this was like a mainstay in our diet. Like you would have just put this along with your cornflakes in the morning. But it's a very, I was used to that very specific species of crawfish, that very red bug. And then here, and I've seen them before, but I'm like, I never internalized how many different species of crawfish there are. Can you talk a little bit about the diversity of this animal? Like talk about a little bit about the numbers here. Like, what are we talking about?
Yeah. It's a great question. So although most people, when you're a kid or when you're eating them, you're only eating or catching like one or two species in your environment, but there's over 700 different species that we currently have known and described. It's probably just over 700. Some people say 650, but I've calculated it, and it's just over 700 now. And so the cool part about these things as well, there's over 700 different types of them. Over 400 of those are in the United States, specifically the eastern United States. And so, like, we are living in the diversity hotspot of these animals. Like, most people think about going to the Amazon or going to Southeast Asia to find like really biodiverse regions. But the Americas and North America has some really great biodiversity, especially these crayfish. So yeah, there's like 700 different species. The epicenter is like Alabama. Alabama has tons of crayfish, well over 100 or over 100 species. As you kind of get farther away from there, it gets a little bit less diverse. And so I live in Pennsylvania, for example. We have like 17, 18 I work in West Virginia. There's like 35 roughly there, different
That's
species.
still a lot, man.
It's still a lot. Yeah, there's so many cool types that, have different unique behaviors or live in very specific environments. And so like, really no matter where you can think of, if there's fresh water, there have been crayfish that have been adapted to live there and kind of exploit that environment because they're all freshwater organisms.
So what's like the geographic spread? Are they in all 50 states or are they, you said they're mostly Eastern US, but I was fly fishing out here in Colorado in the Arkansas River recently, and I'm just wading around and I look down and there's just a massive crawfish in my left foot. And I literally was like, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
I didn't think we had crawfish here. So where are they? Are they in Alaska as well? Hawaii? Like where are these animals?
Yeah. So now humans have spread them everywhere. So there's pretty much invasive crayfish everywhere. So there are invasive crayfish more or less they're in every state. They're in Hawaii. The one that you caught and ate in Louisiana, that species is in Hawaii and it's thriving and it's doing fine. That species is also in Africa, in Australia, in Japan, and everywhere you can imagine. But yeah, they're pretty much everywhere. The native species, most of them in the United States, are in the eastern half of the United States. So kind of like east of Colorado, really the Appalachian Mountains are kind of really where the diversity hotspot is at. That's kind of where they've diversified. But around the world, the book is focusing on North American crayfish, which we kind of have a pretty good understanding of. But they live on every continent except mainland Africa and Antarctica. So they live in Madagascar. But the other diversity hotspot in the world is southeastern Australia. They live in South America, places like Brazil, Chile. They live in South Korea, North Korea, Japan, Europe. They're pretty much everywhere. But the diversity hotspot, like where most of them are at, is the southeastern United States.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to think about, there's such a close, and you talk about this in the book, the kinship of culture in this animal specific, really specific to the Southeast, especially when it comes to like identity, especially like in Louisiana. But I'm really interested to think about you talk about this in other places in the world, like how these animals end up on, in recipes and on the plate, in Asia. It's interesting to think about how this animal is received elsewhere. Is it exotic? Yeah. Is it a pest? Is it, and all these different, you were ringing in these ideas of, thinking about what does a Tokyo crawfish sound like, or whatever, I'm imagining crawfish in Madagascar and I'm wondering how big they are out there. And it's, and Australian sound. He's like, there's all this different stuff, but I guess, if we can back it away for a second, I think maybe here's the thing, because I don't want to take this animal for granted, because one of the amazing things that you do here in this book is not take it for granted. But for people coming to this podcast, maybe we should back down and go, Zack, what's a crawfish? And go from there. Let's build this animal from the ground, literally from the ground up. Like, what's a crawfish and what does it do?
Yeah, so a crawfish is a little freshwater crustacean. They are related to the clawed lobsters that you think of when you think of a lobster. They're in the same kind of taxonomic group, except the clawed lobsters, like the red lobster, it's a clawed lobster. And then there's this other group called a reef lobster. They live in marine environments. And then the crawfish live in freshwater environments. And so they kind of split a long time ago. They look quite similar, but they split roughly 300 million years ago. So a very long time ago. But the crawfish live in freshwater. The kind of confusing thing is that they have all these different names, and that's what I address with the title of the book: crayfish, crawfish, crawdad. People also call them mud bugs, yabbies, ditch crickets, lawn lobsters. There's like a million different names for them. None of them are necessarily wrong, but as a scientist, we call them crayfish. If I'm talking to somebody from the South, I'm not going to call them crayfish. So I'm going to call them crawfish or crawdads, which is what they're called, because that's what they know them as. Where I grew up, they were called crayfish, so the scientists call them crayfish, but it's a kind of geographic spread. It's a little dialect, depending on where you're at, of course. And so these are all different common names referring to these little freshwater crustaceans. What they're doing out in their environment, because there's so many different species, is a lot of things. Some of them live in a stream, some of them live in the mud, some of them dig complex underground burrows. And what many people find is that they're actually one of the most kind of abundant species that are out there. They're kind of unassuming and they're usually hiding, but they're one of the most abundant. So lots of things are eating them. They're eating lots of things. They're really important in the food web. And so these little animals, they can not be so little as well, but most of them are pretty small. They're really important for our ecosystems. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I would answer that question there.
All right. So growing up, I remember walking around in Louisiana and there were all these like little towers. Can you talk a little bit about a crawfish? Is a burrow? Is that the correct term?
We call that tower structure. We call it a chimney. That's
a chimney.
A chimney. Yeah. So we call it a chimney. I've heard people call them towers or volcanoes or mud piles. And what these structures are they're actually made by a crayfish, or if you're down in Louisiana, a crawfish. And what happens is not all of the crayfish require a permanent body of water, like a body of water that's there all the time, like a stream or something like that, or a lake or a river. But some of these crayfish, what happens is when it doesn't rain for months, or when the water table drops, and so when the water goes underneath the ground, what happens is they dig down. So these are what we call burrowing species. They essentially live in an underground tunnel, kind of like what you think of as like a little ant tunnel, or maybe something like naked mole rats. They live down in these tunnel chamber systems that they dig themselves, and then they take a little pile of mud and they stack it outside of their burrow. And so they have an entrance, and then they stack all the little mud piles outside of their burrow, and it makes this weird chimney volcano-looking structure, which is really interesting, and one of the ways that we actually spot and kind of find crayfish sometimes, because they can be 10 feet underground or deeper. And so the way to find them is you find these little structures that they make, and then eventually, if you want to try to get them, you got to dig them up, and it's a big ordeal, but it's quite fun.
I'm curious as far as what do these things eat? I think about crawfish, and I remember when we set crawfish traps and stuff, like we like put chicken liver in like a little mesh net thing. Are they omnivores? Are they? What do they do in the ecosystem? What are crawfish doing?
Yeah, we say they're opportunistic omnivores. That's like the catch-all term for they eat anything. So anything smaller than them, they will eat. Anything bigger than them will generally eat them as well, including each other. They cannibalize each other. But what are they eating? They can eat other crawfish, other little arthropods, like little insects in the environment. They'll eat worms. They'll eat plant material. They'll eat leaf litter. Sometimes they'll even eat sand and stones because of the little algae that grow on it and the microorganisms that grow on it. And so they will literally almost eat anything. And what are they really doing out in their environment? Well, they're consuming a lot of nutrients because they're generally pretty abundant. There's a lot of them out there. One of the other main things that we just talked about is the fact that they're creating these burrows. So they create these burrows, and what that does is it kind of increases the complexity of the habitat. And then a lot of other organisms actually end up using those burrows as habitat. So we like to say that they're both keystone species, meaning that they're like a really important part of the ecosystem. And we also say that they're ecosystem engineers, which is like a beaver, like how a beaver engineers its environment and influences the environment. The crayfish do the same thing with these burrows that they're making, which can be really abundant, as I'm sure you've seen with all the little chimneys that you've seen in Louisiana.
Yeah, I was thinking about Ben Goldfarb's work as I was reading his stuff. And speaking of the tunnels, are you familiar with the gopher tortoise at all? Are you familiar with this animal?
Of course. Same general concept.
Yeah, I was thinking about gopher tortoise burrows because I moved here to Colorado from Florida, And I was living in the interior, the peninsula interior, where we just tons and tons and tons of these beautiful, stubborn animals that will pee all over you the second you pick them up to move them across the road. You know, like they hiss at you. I just love Zach. They're so ornery. I love them. But I was thinking about this tunnel in the same way as like this very kind of keystone thing, because you've got other species living in. Like there was this. You want to talk about this frog that I saw?
Yeah. So there's a frog, and its common name is the crawfish frog.
How convenient.
Yeah, I know. How convenient. And it was given that name because it pretty much relies on a crayfish burrow for its entire life, or for most of its life. It's a frog. It's about the size of my fist or something like that. And what it does is it lives and stays in a crayfish burrow, and that's what it uses for protection. That's what it... If it's not outside of its burrow breeding, they're in the crayfish burrow. So they use it as a home. They either take an empty burrow or probably eat the crawfish that's in there, and then they just live there almost their entire life. People have tracked these crawfish, frogs, and they actually go back to the exact same burrow year after year after year because they don't grow a ton, and it's like a perfect snug fit, essentially. So there's all these really cool animals that have like adapted and evolved to rely on these crayfish burrows as a part of their natural behaviors. There's snakes and salamanders and, you know, spiders that breed and live inside of these burrows, and it's kind of like a really important part of whatever ecosystem they're inhabiting.
Yeah, I didn't know this, but apparently there was a snake that eats only crawfish, like freshly molted crawfish. Is this correct? And there's a whole word for an animal that eats only crawfish, which I thought was Jason Herbert, but turns out there's actually a different term. I was like, what is this? Like this snake?
Yeah.
Can you talk about it?
Yeah, it's the queen snake. It's called a queen snake, and there's also crayfish snakes. There's multiple different species called crayfish snakes, but the queen snake is one of the most famous ones. And what these are stackivores. And so an ecologist, that's somebody who studies crayfish, studying Latin for crayfish and lobster as well. And so an stackivore is something that eats crayfish. And so there are these snakes that have adapted to really only consume or mostly consume crayfish. They can actually smell whenever a crayfish in a stream is molting. And so if it molts, it grows and kind of busts out of its old exoskeleton, and then it releases a hormone because that's associated with this growth process. And these snakes have adapted to sense that hormone in the water, and it's kind of like catnip to them. It kind of drives them crazy, and they go straight to it, and they just find that crayfish and consume them, and they'll like engorge themselves a certain time of the year when the crayfish are molting. So there's all these really awesome kind of relationships between not just the crayfish, which that's what the book's about, obviously, but the crayfish aren't just crayfish because they're connected to all these other organisms, which is part of the reason I love them so much.
Yeah, you know, so my when I was growing up, my dad, when I would go to visit him, my dad ran a bait and tackle shop, and so there was always some sort of like crawfish type lure for like largemouth and smallmouth bass in Kentucky, and that you know, I know that those are a very heavy part, especially for smallmouth. If I recall correctly, smallmouth seem to really enjoy crawfish. Am I correct?
Yeah, like some studies have found that like 80% of smallmouth bass diet is crawfish. So it's a major food source. One of the coolest things that I've done before is I've been snorkeling in a freshwater river, and I'm like lifting rocks underwater. And then the crayfish, what they do when you lift a rock is they go darting out. They run away. And then what ends up happening is all of the fish in the stream, like the bass, they will follow me around. And they'll just wait for me to flip a rock. And I flip it, and the bass will attack the crayfish because they know that they're about to get a food source kind of revealed to them because they can't get under the rock. The bass can't, but I can. And so they can kind of like learn and associate this, and some other people have reported something similar as well.
You know, I've seen that with divers down in Florida, you know, in the saltwater, you know, especially some of the grouper species and some of the triggerfish, they'll just sit and wait. I've seen like these large, like parrotfish looking things, like sit and wait for a guy to like bust open a conch or something like that. And they just, you know, or anemone and they're just sitting there, just sitting there waiting, ready.
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And
Same thing.
did this happen to those poor salamanders as well? Because now I'm just like, I'm thinking about things I would open up under a rock, and salamanders like, I don't want to be part of this, or whatever, because there's it's a fish eat everything kind of world.
Yeah, I
there.
mean, whatever's under there, they'll kind of go after. But yeah, I mean, crayfish, the saying is that anything smaller than a crayfish will eat. Anything bigger than a crayfish will get eaten by a crayfish. And so they're so connected and important in all these different relationships. They'll eat salamanders, but if the salamander's big enough, the crayfish will get eaten by the salamander. So it's this whole kind of interconnected thing.
All right, I'm guessing, Zach, that there's no such thing of a crawfish that dies of old age at this point in time. Like, I have to imagine that every crawfish meets a horrible death. But how long do crawfish live? Like, what's the lifespan?
Yeah, so of course, with over 700 different species, it's going to vary a ton. But some of the common species, let's say the species that I caught when I was a kid in the mountain streams of Pennsylvania, that species will probably live to be 3, maybe 4, at max, longevity, maximum lifespan. The crayfish that you were catching and potentially or definitely eating down in Louisiana, they'll have a live fast, die young type of life cycle. So a year or 2 max. But then there's some species like cave crayfish. Some crayfish live in a cave. And there's burrowing species as well. They can live significantly longer. So there's been cave species that have been suggested to live 30, 40, 50 years.
What?
And then some of the burrowing species, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years potentially. And so there are some that are pretty long lived. Most of them, though, are 1, 2, 3 years is all they're living. A lot of them, of course, are getting eaten during that. Up to 1,000 offspring at once, and maybe 2 of them make it to adulthood. It's that type of thing. But then, there's some variation in that as well.
All right. I feel like this is the point in time that we probably need to talk about. I think that I was not really ready to talk about before reading this book which is invertebrate sex. There is kind of this really interesting story about how crawfish mate. You wanna share this? Because I think the people are gonna like hearing the unique aspects of how crawfish make crawfish babies. You want to fill us in?
This is one of my favorite things, just because once I learned it, I was like, this is crazy. It's one of my favorite parts about crayfish biology. So a lot of crayfish communication, we have to think about how they're mating and deciding to mate and whatnot. And so we have to think about how they communicate. And so we have to kind of get into the eyes of the crayfish, or get into the world of the crayfish. And what that often involves is, first off, your vision is pretty poor. You don't have great vision. You probably aren't seeing predators from a far distance. You can definitely sense movement, but you're not making out images. And so what they often rely on is they rely on chemicals. Essentially, just like our sense of smell is our nose picking up chemicals in the air, or our taste buds picking up chemicals in something that we interact with. But many of these crayfish, of course, are living in water. And so they have to find some other way to sense and send chemicals in the water. And they do this actually with urine. So it's kind of interesting. They do it with urine, which, of course, we think of as a byproduct. But for crayfish, it's a source of information. They use it and send it and receive it amongst one another to communicate information about their environment or their reproductive status. And why they're using urine, we'll think about, the dogs peeing on a stop sign or a fire hydrant outside. What happens is another dog comes by and they smell that urine, and they can actually sense whether it was a big dog, a small dog, a female dog that's about to mate, whether that dog is stressed or has an infection. They can sense all of that in the urine. The crayfish do the exact same thing. So the crayfish do the same thing with urine, and they'll communicate with one another by actually sending it out of what are called nephropores, and that's Latin for pee hole, and that's in the front of their face, essentially. It's in their teeth. And so they send out this urine, and then another crayfish can sense it, and this is what starts often like the mating process and the mating ritual. They'll send urine, communicate a little bit. They will engage in a fight. It's kind of like a little tussle or a little fight. But eventually, once if the female is accepting and the male is kind of a good enough male for the female, then what happens is they actually have sex missionary style, which is pretty rare for animals. Obviously, humans are familiar with this. Generally, it's the female on the bottom and the male is kind of sandwiched up on top, and they clasp up against one another, and they'll do this for minutes, for hours sometimes. And so during that, this is actually where sperm transfer will occur. They have these like little hooked penises called gonopods. There's two of them, kind of look like little hooks, and they transfer the sperm to the female. The female will generally then just take it and then release eggs at another time where it'll become fertilized and kind of like a fertilization soup. Essentially, is she secretes her eggs, sperm's already there. They mix it all up. A little bit later, there's going to be fertilized eggs that turn into little baby crayfish. And so it's this big, long process, and there's a lot of cool stuff going on with crayfish sex for sure.
And by cool, you mean absolutely gross. You've got pee coming out of faces. It's just a hot mess. Like I can't begin to imagine.
Gross. Yeah, it's only gross if you think about it from the human perspective. There's a lot worse. I could tell you a lot worse stories about animals having sex. The crayfish are pretty run of the mill.
All right, we'll bring you back on for that second podcast. We'll get a bunch of biologists together and make sure everyone's good and drunk and signs an NDA. One of the really cool things about what you're doing in this book is you're kind of giving us little case studies. You can't cover every species everywhere, right? But we're kind of popping around, and you're doing this really cool thing. I love how illustrated this thing is because it really helps to understand the distribution. And like you start talking about these colors, you say blue, and what you really mean is blue. I mean, the bright blue, the colors here are just amazing. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the places that you've been that maybe kind of taught you the most about, crayfish and like, maybe unexpected discoveries along the way, on your way to your PhD and your work now?
Yeah. So obviously my research and my kind of goal with this book is to understand crayfish diversity. And as I mentioned, there's over 700 different types. I'm never going to be able to get my hands on all the different types. So what happens is oftentimes every time I collect a new species, I kind of learn something new, which is really fun, something I didn't really think about or realize. Probably the most memorable is when I went, the most memorable place and most that I've learned about crayfish is when I went to Northern California and snorkeled for this species called the Shasta crayfish. Ophthophasticus fortis. It's one of the coolest, most bizarre, and most imperiled, if not the most imperiled species in the United States or potentially the world. And what I think of when I think of a crayfish is you flip a rock, you put your hand in a stream, and you go to try to catch them, and they instantly are super aggressive. Super aggressive. They have their claws up front. They're trying to pinch you. I've been pinched 1,000 times. That's what I think of when I think of a crayfish. When I went to Northern California and collected this species called the Shasta crayfish, its old common name was the placid crayfish, and placid means calm and relaxed. And this crayfish that I collected and saw, it was like unlike anything I've ever seen before. You just hold it in your hand, and it just sits there. It doesn't move. It doesn't pinch. There are these people that have been working on them for their entire lives, 30, 40 years, and they say they've never been pinched by this crayfish, despite handling hundreds of them. And so, like, it's such a unique, weird thing. They also aggregate together. You'll flip a rock, and there used to be like 10 of them under the same rock, and they would never leave. Like, the same 10 would always be there. And that's just unheard of for any of the species that I study or that I've worked with, because they just fight each other all the time normally. That's what crayfish do. They kind of fight every day. That's a lot of the ways they communicate. So just going to Northern California and snorkeling in these beautiful environments for this rare species, it really showed me like how much cool stuff is out there and how much I don't know. And it made me that much more excited to go and learn about and study different species in different parts of the world with is really one of my life goals, is to go all around the world to study and photograph and teach people about crayfish.
You want to talk about Crawzilla?
Yeah, Crawzilla.
This thing is cool. Like, I was like, what is this? You want to talk about Crawzilla? Crawzilla is really neat.
Yeah, Crawzilla, it's a species that was described a few years ago. I think like 2022, 2021, something like that, 2018, in that ballpark. And its common name is the Crawzilla crawdad. That's its like official scientific name, Crawzilla.
He wins. That wins the crawfish naming, right?
Yeah, and it's badass because this thing is just a massive species, and it can be like bright greenish, not bright green, but it could be greenish brown, kind of looks like Godzilla or Crawzilla or whatever. And the thing that's special about it is it's one of those burrowing species we mentioned that dig all the way down, but it's really big. Most of the burrowing species are like pretty small. This Crawzilla crawdad could be absolutely massive. The holes that it creates to dig down, I've been like this deep inside of them, and my arm is not even touching the sides of the wall. So they build like massive holes, and they dig really deep down. And I've pulled out a bunch of them from burrows, even had them pinch me, and it hurts really bad. You can like put your hand in there, and then they're aggressive, so they'll pinch you, and you pull them out when they pinch you. So it's, this massive burrowing species from the Midwest, generally is where they're from, Western Kentucky, Western Tennessee, Illinois, Indiana, places like this.
I mean, I'm from Western Kentucky, so that's awesome.
They've been there. Yeah, you've probably walked right past their burrows and never known it.
Yeah, and frankly, because we grew up in Louisiana, I've always been a bit of a snob. I'm like, those aren't real crawfish because those aren't from the swamp. That kind of gets me to maybe another question. Zach, you've been all over the country, and you're obviously not just spending time, pulling over rocks and observing these animals, but you're also talking to people, right?
Yeah.
In your time, do people talk about like what these animals mean as far as like, is there a cultural relationship in different parts of the country that come to this animal? I mean, what's the human connection to this species?
Yeah, so these are really important animals, I think, to people throughout the United States, but oftentimes in very different ways. So, the title of the book is The Biology and Conservation of North America's Favorite Crustacean. That's a huge claim because we have things like clawed lobsters and blue crabs and a lot of.
We don't care about Maine here, pal.
Yeah, I know. I agree. So to me, the reason I titled it that is because whenever I talk to someone about my work, whenever I'm in a stream or in a ditch or at a restaurant or at a conference and somebody talks to me about these animals, every time I tell them that I study crayfish, oftentimes their eyes kind of like light up. And they light up because they're either like, oh, I caught these animals as a kid. It was like my favorite thing to do as a kid. Or, I love eating these things. Culturally, it's really important for me. Or I used to go fishing and with my grandpap, and we would use these as bait, and he would catch them. Like, everyone has some memories or associations with them. So I think they're kind of like culturally ingrained throughout the United States, which is part of the reason I think I'm kind of connected to them, because everyone else has this connection to them, and they're not only in North America, but I feel like they're most diverse things, so it's like part of the culture of North America to have these little crustaceans, and everybody has these relationships with them. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of really different. It's either they caught them as a kid and they loved it because of that, or they eat them in the past, or they still do. All of those are like really valid reasons to enjoy these animals because they can be enjoyed in many different ways and, appreciated in many different ways.
Do you know the story of the Cajun and the crawfish, the myth? Have you heard this one?
I'm ashamed that I don't think I do.
All right, I'm going to interject my own podcast and tell it because it's a super short story, right?
I want to.
Okay, so all right, so that Cajuns come from Canada, obviously from Acadia, up in present-day Nova Scotia. And I remember I told the story. I actually told the story when I was receiving lobster. A very good friend of mine who lives up in Maine, who will remain nameless, had made lobster for me. She and her husband are dear friends of mine. And I told this story. And essentially what happened was the Acadians up in Canada have a very close relationship to the lobster, obviously economically, food, so forth. Right? It was their best friend. And then the English took over. The Acadian expulsion happened after the 7 Years' War, and all these Acadians scattered, and some of them, as you know, end up in Louisiana.
Yeah.
But then that left their friend, the lobster, all alone in Canada.
Yeah.
Where did their friends go? So the lobsters got up. They came out of the water and they crawled overland to the Mississippi River. And then they swam all the way down the Mississippi to finally find their friends in Louisiana. But it was a perilous journey, right? They wore down, and over time they got smaller and smaller and smaller until they finally got down to Louisiana and found their friends, the Cajuns now, and they could be friends forever. So that's how the crawfish and the Cajun came to be together, was through this myth of the Acadians. So it's a story we like to tell.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, the second you started going off of that, I mean, hey, I study crayfish evolution, and it turns out it was just, they just walked from Canada and became a little bit smaller. So that's all.
Obviously. Yeah, clearly. I want to ask you about, actually, because there's a real somber note here in your work, Zack. There really there's an undercurrent, there's an urgency to this. You're reading this book and it's really enjoyable, and you're finding out all these really different facts about this really cool animal. And at the same time, you're learning, wait a second, a lot of these species are in peril. And not only are they in peril, they're really big indicators of climate change, of pollution, of ecosystems. Can you talk a little bit about how these animals function to tell us what's going on in our ecosystem, and like why some of these species are actually in threat of extinction?
Yeah. So the first part, the whole indicator species thing, this is the idea that like the presence or absence of an organism can tell us about the health of the environment. And this is definitely true with a lot of crayfish species, as we find that once the natural conditions that these animals have evolved in, once those change a little bit, there are plenty of species that will more or less disappear. If the water gets a little bit warmer, or a little bit colder, or a little bit more polluted, or the habitat gets changed a little bit, they will just completely disappear in populations that they've been in for probably millions of years. And so this is like a pretty big deal with these crayfish, is that they're indicator species of the environment health many times. The presence of specific types of crayfish is generally a good indicator of the health of the ecosystem. The whole kind of sad part, the hard part about all of this is we have all these amazing, beautiful crayfish in the United States, but approximately half of them require some conservation attention or have been in decline since really we've started to study them. Why is this happening? Well, it's not too surprising. These are freshwater animals, and so they really rely on that fresh water. What humans and many, primarily humans, of course, are doing is we're impacting the ecosystems in a lot of different ways. We are putting our wastewater into rivers and streams and creeks. That's polluting them. We are altering the habitat. In some cases, destroying the tops of mountains, if we're talking about coal mining in Appalachia. What that does is it leads to downstream effects, literal downstream effects, where all of that rock that gets exploded has to go somewhere. It oftentimes goes down into the streams. It mucks them up. It pollutes them. It fills all those little cracks in the crevices. We also have some pretty huge issues with like disease spread, and people actually taking one species of crayfish, like I mentioned before, with invasive crayfish being everywhere. They take a species and they go fishing with it, and then they maybe travel 3 hours and go fishing somewhere else, and then they just dump them off there. That can lead to actually declines in native populations of crayfish as well. And so even other crayfish are negatively impacting native crayfish. And so my book kind of gets into all these intricacies of it all, and in some ways it is sad. There are crayfish species that have gone extinct. There will be crayfish species that are currently alive that will go extinct during my life. And, that's a rough thing to deal with, but it's pretty much guaranteed in many different groups.
One of my absolute heroes in my professional is Dan Flores. and he talks a lot about charismatic megafauna, bison and horses, mammoth. I would even argue, you might even consider like beaver when you go back to Goldfarb's work. Do you think that's the reason why crawfish don't get included in these conversations? I had never thought about them.
Yeah, I think one of the best conservation strategies, of course, like learning about these little organisms is important, but one of the best and kind of easiest conservation strategies is to get people to care about the biggest, most charismatic animal. And if you care about them, generally that leads to downstream protection and conservation of all the small little ants and the little microorganisms as well. And so, it's kind of just not thrown into the mix with those large charismatic megafauna because there's also no education on it. Like there's no resource out there for someone to go out there and really just learn about these organisms. And that was one of the main motivators for me to write this book. So I think it's kind of tough. They're small as well, so we know less about them. You don't see them as often. So there's a lot of reasons. Like, do I ever expect anyone to care about crayfish as much as they do a panda? No. I'm not going to argue with that. Like these large charismatic pandas or bison or whatever it may be. But getting some people to at least understand and care about these animals, I think, is really important because, we can protect them by protecting the environment, but we also need to understand what we have here and kind of cherish it with these little crustaceans.
Well, if you don't mind me saying, when I'm reading your book, and I did do my research and see your work and, followed you on social and stuff like that, your work kind of reminds me of Solomon David in some ways. If you know Solomon's work, he does work on gar, alligator gar stuff. He's now at my alma mater at the University of Minnesota. I know Solomon a little bit. But in a lot of ways, it feels to me, Zach, about your own work, you're taking on this thing where, Solomon gets in here and people are just shooting gar left and right and calling it trash fish. And I feel like he's done such amazing work really promoting the species to get people. And he's not saying, hey, don't kill this animal. He's saying, if you're going to kill it, eat it. It's good, whatever. But he's like, talk about the importance of gar to the ecosystem. And I feel, Zach, and I hope this is all right. Like, I feel your work is a lot like that, in much in this vein. Like you're this dude saying, hey, look at this really cool animal that we take for granted. And this book, and I think that in a lot of ways your social profiles and frankly the enthusiasm that kind of comes across is like, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of Solomon's work. And I hope you take that. I mean, that's the highest praise I can give because I think the world of this stuff.
At the Crayfish Lab at West Liberty, we kind of look up to the gar lab. They've been doing freshwater social media conservation for a long time. And so, that's like high praise, I think. And I think Solomon David's doing amazing work with everything he's doing, kind of promoting a group that not many people think much about. And they're really interesting from a biological perspective, from a cultural perspective. That's the same, kind of deal that I'm trying to do and that we're trying to do at West Liberty. We have a lot of people at my university geared at studying these animals and teaching people about these animals. And so, that's definitely a huge compliment. So I appreciate that.
How do you come across your students, or who's taking your classes at West Liberty? Like what are those? What's that look like for you?
Yeah, so we're a smaller regional university in the northern panhandle. Most of the students are from the area. Most of the students are from the northern panhandle of West Virginia, which is a really cool place, in neighboring Ohio and Pennsylvania a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, I teach classes like zoology, teaching people about animals. They see me go out there and nerd out about crayfish. They see me nerd out about all these animals, and they get weirded out because the professor is talking about missionary position in crayfish. But some of them get really interested, and they're like, this is crazy. Like, why is he talking about this? Like, there's got to be something interesting going on here. And so a lot of students, what they end up doing is they end up doing research with me, and they end up doing some sort of research at the university. And that's where the kind of community that we have at the Crayfish Lab at West Liberty is amazing, because everyone works together. We all want to learn. We all want to learn from each other, and we can really do some like awesome stuff. So the students, there's a lot of different types of students from all over the country, not just from North America, not just from West Virginia. And so we get a lot of different people generally interested in animals and aquatics and conservation. And even if, they want to study fish eventually, studying crayfish, for example, is a great way of kind of segueing into that. So we get a lot of really amazing students at my university.
That's awesome. And I'm delighted to hear the work that you're doing. I've spent a little time in West Virginia. I think it's one of the most beautiful places that it's just a gorgeous, like I'm always telling people, like, you've got to go to West Virginia. It's insanely beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
All right. You just wrote this book and you're teaching and you've been doing all this work. What comes next for you? Are you the kind of person that's got already had another thing in the pipeline, or you're going to sit back and go, do I talk about Australian crawfish next? Like what happens for you? What comes next?
Yeah, so this book being officially out is a huge, not relief, but it's a huge kind of step in my career.
Awesome.
I feel like, I'm really proud of it, and I'm really happy.
You should be, man. This is good stuff.
Yeah, it's great. So really what I want to do now is continue focusing on my research and focus on bigger picture, more impactful projects, whether that be books, whether that be bigger types of review papers teaching people about different parts of crayfish biology. And so, I'm always going to be teaching. I'm always going to be studying crayfish. I'm always going to be photographing crayfish. That's something that before this book, I've never taken a photograph in my life. I don't call myself a photographer or photographer. But now photographing crayfish is like a huge passion of mine. I love it because it's one of the best ways to showcase these animals. A lot of them don't even have photos. Like, how can I get someone to care about something that there's not even a literal photo of?
Right.
That's the case. So photographing crayfish, traveling all around, catching as many as I can, photographing as many as I can. That's another huge goal of mine. But yeah, nothing crazy, no book, nothing like that, or at least not for a while, I don't think. I just want to kind of continue in my career. I'm still pretty early in my career, so got lots of time to figure out where it goes.
Well, brother, I got to tell you, I was so excited when the book arrived. I just tore into it when people weren't trying to steal it from me. I've been preaching about this book like on social and just in my personal life because Zack, I think you did something really amazing here. I'm not kidding.
Thank you.
This is really cool stuff, man. I was so giddy about this, and sitting here talking to you is having the best conversation about this really interesting animal. Dude, this is a blast. So thank you so very, very much. This has been a delight.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I could talk about these animals all day, every day, and that's what I try to do as much as possible. So, yeah.
Well, good. We'll have you come back on for the animal sex episode sometime.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guest, Dr. Zack Graham. Zack, that was amazing. I am so excited about your work, about your career, and your trajectory. That was amazing. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. Thank you to my mom and dad for making me eat crawfish growing up. And thank you, most of all, to all of you for continuing to share this podcast. If you like what you heard, make sure that you subscribe to the pod and that you leave us a good review on on Apple or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen. We've got a whole bunch of pods coming your way. Make sure you stay tuned. Make sure you subscribed, and we'll see you later. Ciao for now. Bye.